Our scripture today, we're actually going to be looking at Genesis 22, verse 20, all the way through the end of 25, verse 18. So rather than read for 30 minutes, I'll read just one section here. 25, verse 7 through 11. Abraham lived 175 years. And then Abraham breathed his last, and he died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. And there Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai Roi. We don't like loose ends. In fact, we like our stories to end, and they lived happily ever after. The most popular television series, finale, anybody remember what it was? MASH. And that's because it wrapped up all the loose ends, and we found out that Klinger stayed in Korea after spending all those years of trying to get out of there. And that's how we like our stories to end. We want everything to wrap up. And the writer of Genesis seems to realize that. And so Genesis ties up most of its loose ends. And so we've been looking at lots of genealogies, and most of the time when we read the genealogies in the Bible, we skip over them because we don't recognize the names, we don't understand what their purpose is, and so we miss how the scriptures wrap up the loose ends and how the genealogies are bookends of sections. We didn't have a genealogy to start the story of Adam because there was no genealogy. But when we get to the end of Adam and Eve and Cain and Seth, we had a genealogy which finished it up. Then we had a genealogy that started Noah, and we found out where Noah came from. And then a genealogy finished up the Noah section as we've read about where his boys ended up. And then we started a genealogy with Abraham, with his father Terah, and now we're going to have a genealogy that ends the sequence of Abraham, and we'll tie up those various loose ends. But we're going to look at 3 genealogies, 3 funerals, and a wedding today. And so the place to start is we're going to start with a genealogy. And it's going to tie up one of the loose ends. And the reason why I want us to look at this genealogy is because it is going to set the stage for the next generation that we'll be looking at when we look at Isaac. Now, I don't know how well you can see this, but I'll run through it as to who it is. You have Terah at the top left, the square, and he has a wife who gave him Sarah. And then he had another wife, and none of these women are named, by the way. And it was this wife that gave 3 sons to Terah: Abraham, Haran, and Nahor. Now, we have already looked at Haran. Haran was the one who died at Ur. He was married. We don't know who his wife was, but he had 2 children, Milcah and Lot. And as we know, Lot is the one who traveled with Abraham, and we tied up the Lot genealogy because Lot was the one who his wife was killed in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then he ended up sleeping with his 2 daughters who gave him 2 sons who are also their brothers, which is where we got the Moabites and the Ammonites. And so that tied up that particular loose end. But this genealogy now is going to pick up Milcah, and we're going to find out what happens to her. So Milcah ends up marrying her uncle Nahor. Now, this was not an incestuous relationship. There wasn't a seduction involved. But this is one of those relationships that later is called a Levirate relationship. And what the Levirate relationships are is that if you have a widow or if you have somebody who has not had children, the next of kin or the closest next of kin is supposed to marry them in order to provide offspring so that the inheritance gets passed down. And so Abraham takes Lot, and Nahor marries Milcah in order to make sure that there is a genealogy that's going to pass down from Haran. Well, Milcah and Nahor have 8 children. 8 boys. There may have been more, but we know that there are 8 boys. The one that's important is we have a boy whose name was Bethuel. Bethuel marries, and he has at least 2 children, Rebekah and Laban. When women are mentioned in a genealogy, that is rare. And so we need to pay attention as to why Rebekah's name is mentioned. We're going to pick up her genealogy. We're going to pick up this end of the story in the loose end pretty quickly because Isaac is going to marry Rebekah. So that's why this particular genealogy was listed in there. But the first thing that we read then after this genealogy is we read about the death of Sarah. And there are 3 things about Sarah's death in the story that we need to lift up. The first one is the fact that Abraham loved his wife, Sarah. Now, in the sermons that I have been giving about Abraham, I've been pretty tough on him, calling him a moral midget and all these sorts of things. And he was. He made some very questionable decisions. But again, when we read these stories, we're reading them through our Western eyes, our Western culture, and what Abraham did was right in line with what their culture was. Very, very patriarchal culture. What that meant is that the men own everything and have all of the power. Women are property. And their most important, if not their sole function, is to bear children and to raise them. And so consequently, since Abraham has all the power, he sees no reason why he needs to consult Sarah. Since he's the most important one, that he thinks the promise is coming through, he doesn't see a problem with jeopardizing Sarah. But he doesn't realize is that the promise of the offspring for the descendants is to come through Sarah. And so he is risking things when he allows her to be in Pharaoh's harem and to be in Abimelech's harem. But we know that Abraham loves Sarah because after Hagar has a child, he doesn't divorce her. And then when she dies, we find, when you read the Hebrew, we find that Abraham grieved and mourned deeply. The second thing that we read, though, is that he needs to secure a tomb for his wife. And that needs to be a good tomb for her. Abraham is hanging out near Hebron, the Oaks of Mamre. This is where that particular location was. And so in those days, of course, they don't have the embalming. When somebody dies, you bury them right away. And so Abraham has this very tight timeline. And so he goes into the city of Hebron to the gate. And the gate is where all the guys hang around because they're the ones who have all the power, right? So the elders of the city, they hang around at the gate of Hebron. And that's where they decide the business dealings and the political dealings of the city. And so Abraham goes there, and we read how he negotiates for a tomb. Because he is a foreigner, he has no standing in the area. He has no real legal rights. And we read that when they ask for a business dealing, you don't say, sell me a piece of land. What you say is, would you ask Ephron, the son of Zophar, if he would give me this piece of land? And then you ask other people to inquire for you. You use intermediaries. And you use a very humble position. And so Abraham was considered to be a prince. He was, a wealthy guy, and everybody knew about his situation, and he goes to the city gates, and he humbly says, I'm an alien here, I'm a foreigner, I don't have any legal rights here, but would you please inquire if Ephron would sell me the cave at the end of his field? Well, Ephron is sitting right there. And so Ephron says to the elders, he says, tell Abraham that I would love to give him my field with the cave, with all the trees. And so he's negotiating with Abraham to buy more than what Abraham wants. And it's either because Ephron has a tax liability or something that he wants to get out from under this. And so Abraham says, I am willing to give the full price. So they're not really talking about giving it away. They're selling it. And so Ephron says, well, what is 400 shekels of silver among friends? Now, some commentators think that he's fleecing Abraham, that he's selling him more than he wants and that he's asking an exorbitant price. It really doesn't matter. Abraham could afford it. He is wealthy. And he says, sure. And so Abraham buys the cave of Machpelah, which is why a lot of your cemeteries are called Machpelah, if you've ever noticed that. So he buys this cave of Machpelah, which is at the end of Ephron's field with all of the trees, as a permanent burial place. And so the land was titled and transferred to Abraham as a down payment on the promised land. So this is the first down payment for that. The third thing that we read from this story is what we don't read, and that is who is not at the funeral. And it's Isaac. Now, he may have been here, but if he was there, it probably would have been mentioned that he was buried, or that she was buried by her son Isaac and Abraham. But we have no mention of Isaac being there. My opinion, my speculation, is that there is tension between Abraham and Isaac about what had happened on Mount Moriah. And so Abraham lives at Hebron, and Isaac lives in the Negev, which is a desert to the south of there between the land of Canaan and the Egyptians. And my suspicion is what happened is that when Sarah got sick, she got sick quickly. She died quickly. They sent word to Isaac, but word didn't get there in time for him in order to get back from the funeral. But we do know that he is very, very close to his mother, and we'll read about that in the next story that we look at. That is the bride for Isaac. Now, one of the last things that Abraham needs to do is to provide a bride for Isaac in order that the descendants will be taken care of. And so what Isaac does, or what Abraham does, is he gets one of his trusted servants, evidently his most trusted servant, and he makes him take a vow. And he says to this servant that my son Isaac cannot marry one of the Canaanite girls. So you need to go back to my home country, to my home kinfolk, back to the land of Haran, and to find a bride for my son Isaac. And this is what you need to do for me. You need to promise that you're going to do it. So the servant says, okay, I'll do that. But he says, what happens if I go back and I find this girl and she will not agree to come back to Canaan to marry Isaac? Should I then take Isaac back to the land of Haran? And Abraham says, no, whatever you do, do not take my son back. And if you can't find a bride for my son, then you are relieved of this particular vow. And so the servant takes off. He takes 10 camels with him. We're not told at this particular point in the story that he has an entourage, but he does. There are other servants with him and other probably soldiers, and these camels are all laden with gold and silver and all kinds of precious things that are for the dowry for this young lady. And so they take off across the desert, go up and around. They go up to the land of Ur. And when the servant gets there, he parks the camels outside of the city of Ur, the city of Haran, not the city of Ur, the city of Haran, which is where Abraham's kinfolk lived. And he has these camels kneel down, and the well is where the young ladies would come out in the evening in order to draw water. Kind of like going to the food court at the mall, okay? And so this is where the young guys would hang out in the evening too. They wouldn't draw any water, but they'd go and they'd check out the local girls. I mean, that's what you did. That was the meeting place for the young people. And this servant, he knew that. And so he goes there, and what you need to realize is that only rich people had camels. It's kind of like having a Cadillac Escalade all tricked out. And so he's got 10 of these, that are parked, out in the parking lot in front of the food court. And so he's very, very conspicuous as to who he is. And he's got his entourage as well. They would look, pretty spiffy. And so they're all outside, the well, checking out the local girls. And this servant is a fascinating character because of his prayer life. He is a wonderful guy. And so he begins to pray, and he addresses God as the God of Abraham. He says, he says, to the God of my master Abraham. He says, here's what I need. He says, my master has sent me on this mission to find a bride for Isaac. And here's what I would like. I want to know that I'm in the right place at the right time to find the right girl. And the way that I will know this is that if a young lady comes and draws water, and I run up to her and ask her to give me a drink of water, and she not only gives me a drink of water, but then says, let me water your camels for you, I will know that this is the right girl. And he had just finished up his prayer when he looks, and here comes Rebecca. We had a spoiler alert, which is why the genealogy told us about who Rebecca was. So here comes Rebecca, and we're told that she is a beautiful girl and that she's eligible, which means she wasn't married. And she comes down, and he sees her, and she's probably checking him out too, by the way. And so she gets her water, and he runs to her, which would be unusual for somebody to run to a girl, but he runs to this girl, and he asks her for a drink of water. And so she lowers the jar off of her shoulder, and she gives him a drink of water, and then she says, let me water your camels for you. Now, camels, when they're thirsty, can drink 25 gallons of water. You have 10 camels. That could be anywhere from 100 to 250 gallons of water. That's anywhere from a half a ton to a ton. How would you like to lift that much water? And that's what this girl does. Not only is she pretty, but she is strong. And she has a servant's heart. And so she fills up this trough. And, their well would be like, you'd have to kind of reach down and fill up this trough. And so she fills up this trough, and she waters all these camels. And the servant and his entourage, they're just watching this. And then the servant gives a prayer of thanksgiving. I mean, he is so grateful that he prays to God and thanks God for leading him to this girl. And then he gives her a gold nose ring and golden arm bracelets. And he finds out who she is, finds out that she is Rebecca, the daughter of Bethuel, who had been born to Milcah of Nahor. So he knows that it's the right family connection. And he says, do you have fodder for our camels and a place for us to stay? And so Rebecca says, yes, she can do that. And so she runs back to her mother's house, and the servant is staying there at the well, praying and probably packing things up and getting ready to go. And so she runs to her mother's house, and she tells her mother what has happened to her. And now we meet Uncle Laban. Now, we will read an awful lot about Uncle Laban in our next section, but we get an idea about Uncle Laban because he sees the gold arm bracelets that she's wearing and the gold ring, and he is thinking, oh boy, this has some promise. He is greedy, and he sees the gold. And so when he finds out that this rich guy with these 10 Cadillacs is parked out in front of the food court, he runs down there in a hurry. And he says, oh, you guys, bring these things over here. I'll wash your cars for you. So he takes care of the camels. He feeds them and all this stuff. And he's really pouring it on. And then Bethuel finally shows up. And the reason why we think that Bethuel wasn't there to begin with is he probably has more than one wife. And so he was at the other wife's house. And so he finds out that there's these rich guys that are coming over to his wife's house. And so he shows up. And the servant comes in, he brings him in. And they set food before him. And the servant says, I need to tell you why I'm here first. Now, normally you wouldn't tell the story until after you had eaten. But he is, he's so interested in telling his story that he says, let me tell you why I'm here. And he says, my servant or my master Abraham. Now, immediately, this is Abraham's kin. And they would go, ho, this is Abraham. Now, somehow Abraham had heard that Milcah had had these children, and so there had been some connections going on, and they probably had some inkling that Abraham had done well for himself, and so now they have evidence of it. And so this servant says that Abraham, God has blessed him. He is rich. He is doing really well. And Sarah, in her old age, has borne him a son, Isaac. And the reason that I'm here is to find a wife for Isaac. And my master has said that if I can't find a wife, then I am released from this vow. Now, he tells this story for a couple of reasons. One is he wants to make sure that Rebekah's family realizes that Isaac is not too old for her, because of this great, age discrepancy that there would have been. And so they find out that no, that Isaac's about, is at the marriageable age for Rebekah, and that he doesn't have ulterior motives, that, he wasn't here to kidnap these girls, but, was sent here on a mission. And so Laban and Bethuel, they hear this, they see the gold armbands, they see the gold ring, and they think, we think this is of God. Now, they use the same word that Abraham's servant had used for God. And we have no reason to believe that Bethuel and Laban are followers of God. They hadn't been, but they used that language in order to ingrate themselves with the servant. And then the servant, he worships. He gives thanks, and he praises God, and he thanks God, and goes into this thanksgiving prayer. And I suspect that Laban and Bethuel are kind of amused by this, because for them, this was not a religious experience, it was a business transaction. But for the servant, this was a spiritual event. So he gives praise and thanksgiving to God. So then they sit down and they eat. In the morning, the servant wants to head back right away with his entourage. He wants to get started. And so Laban and Rebekah's mother, they want to delay things. They say, no. We would really like Rebekah to stick around for at least 10 days. Now, we don't know if they were getting cold feet because of this transaction, but most likely what they were hoping to do was to keep delaying the leaving. And the reason why they would want to keep delaying the servant's leaving is hopefully the servant would change the agreement so that Isaac would come their way, so that Abraham's wealth would be more accessible to them rather than Abraham's wealth being so far away. And so Rebekah's mother and her brother Laban are the ones who are making the business transaction, not Bethuel, by the way. And so they say, well, we'll let Rebekah make the decision. And they're probably thinking that Rebekah is going to say, I want to stay. But she doesn't. She shocks them when she says, sure, I'll go and marry this guy right away. So there must be a family issue that's going on that she's looking to get out of town. And so they load up the retinue, or they load up the camels. And so you have the servant's entourage. And Rebekah has her own entourage. She has her nurse, which we later find out is named Deborah, which means that she wants to keep her own health plan rather than taking Isaac's health plan, by the way. So she's keeping her own health plan, and her retinue, or her entourage, and they all load up, and that's why you had to have 10 camels, and they all head back to where Isaac is. And they bypass where Abraham is at Hebron, which is interesting. And they go straight to the Negev. And Isaac is out walking in his field one evening. And he looks up and he sees the caravan coming. And Rebekah, on one of the camels, sees Isaac walking in the field. So she says to the servant, is that Isaac? Is that my husband? The servant says, yes. So she takes her bridal veil and puts it on to prepare herself for her marriage. Then the caravan gets to Isaac's field, and there they meet. Now, we don't know if Isaac is pleasantly surprised by this, whether he knew that Abraham had sent to get a wife for him, or whether he's in shock, or, we have no idea what he's thinking or what's going on. We don't know if they got married that night, or whether there was a courtship involved, and if there was some sort of a wedding. None of that is told us in the story. All we're told is that Isaac loved Rebekah, and he took her into his mother's tent, and then he was comforted after his mother's death. The side story here is that Isaac loved his mother. So somehow he had come in possession of his mother's tent, which means he probably missed the funeral, but he went back for the estate sale. And he got his mother's tent. And that's not that funny. And you thought we were different from those people, right? And he lived in his mother's tent so that he could feel close to her. And when he marries Rebekah, he takes her into his mother's tent. And that's where they begin their life together. And so now he has tied up the loose end of his grief with his mother. And so that was the wedding. But then the very next chapter, we read a very interesting genealogy about Keturah. Abraham had a third wife named Keturah who gave him 6 sons. And we don't know anything about this girl, and we don't know anything about the sons except 2 of them show up later as being territorial areas where tribes are located. And so we don't know anything about them, but evidently the original readers of Genesis did know who Keturah was and did know who these people were, and so this ties up that loose end as to where she came from. Some think that Abraham married Keturah after Sarah died, and others think that he married her while Sarah was still alive. My opinion is I think he married her afterwards. But what we find is that when she's first mentioned, she's called the wife of Abraham, but when we get to the end of the paragraph, she's downgraded to a concubine. And she has these 6 children, and then Abraham deals with them the same way that he deals with any conflict or potential conflict. When they become of age to inherit, he sends them away. He gives them gifts, he cuts them off, but he keeps them separate from Isaac. And so we have this genealogy, which we tie up with Keturah, which doesn't really tie it up for us, but it does for them. And then you get Abraham's obituary and his funeral. And what we're told is that Abraham was 175 years old, and when he died, his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him. That is significant. The fact that both of them were there means that they knew when Abraham was getting sick. And these 2 boys came back. Now, I suspect that the tension between Isaac and Ishmael was basically non-existent. That's my opinion. I don't think the boys had a problem with each other. It was their mothers, Sarah and Hagar, who had the problem. But I think that Isaac and Ishmael actually got along pretty well. And so they bury their father, and they tie up that particular loose end. And then the story jumps ahead 70 years. Genesis jumps ahead 70 years to tie up the loose end of Ishmael. What happens to Ishmael? Well, we find out that Ishmael does have 12 sons, that they are mighty princesses. They become what we would now know as the Arab nations, or the Arab League. And Ishmael lives a good long life. He lives to be 137 years of age. And he dies and is gathered up into his kin, and we get his particular genealogy as well. Implications then. You have 3 funerals, 3 genealogies, and a wedding. When you put all of these stories together, one of the things that we could have looked at is the incredible devotion of Abraham's servant in his prayer life. It's amazing that, he prays for guidance, and when he gets his prayers answered, he thanks God for them. How many of us, when we pray for guidance and we receive the guidance, we remember to thank God for that? Most of the time we get a prayer answer and we just think, oh, well, that was me. And, we forget that God was the one involved. And so Abraham's servant, I would, really would recommend you read that section again of the wedding and just concentrate on what he does and how God responds with him. We could have looked at God's sovereignty in providing a wife for Isaac, how all of these things get arranged. But what I want to just very, very briefly hint at is our need for reconnection. Blood really is thicker than water. Families are important. That's why you have those genealogies, is that family is important. And Abraham, even though he'd lived off in Canaan and had cut himself off from his family of origin, had cut himself off from Hagar, had cut himself off from Keturah, still had a deep need to connect. And so who he chose to connect with was his brother Nahor and Milcah, in order to keep that connection with his family of origin, which is why he sent the servant back to find a wife for Isaac. We have that same need. And the reason why I think you find the wedding and the funerals being recorded is that weddings and funerals are ways for our families as well to connect and to reconnect. How many times is the only time that you ever see some of your extended family is at a wedding or a funeral? You never see them anywhere else, but you come back for the funeral, you come back for the wedding, or if you can't make the wedding, you at least you send something. You make that reconnection. These rituals are sacraments. In the Catholic Church, they're called a sacrament. They ought to be a sacrament in our churches as well, because they provide a very unique function of helping our families heal. Now, a wedding or a funeral can't undo the damage of a divorce or neglect or some of those things that have happened, but oftentimes they can open the door for forgiveness. They can begin to provide a healing environment. Rarely do you have people acting out at a wedding or at a funeral because you've got it, it's in a public place and you have a pastor involved and people are afraid to act out in front of pastors and these sorts of things. And with a little coaching, you can actually use these rituals in order for healing to begin to take place. Can you imagine the conversation that Isaac and Ishmael must have had over potato salad at Abraham's funeral dinner? Ishmael. Well, Dad, he kicked me out of the family with just a loaf of bread and a jar of water, and we almost died in the desert. Isaac. Well, Dad took me, tied me onto an altar, and was going to cut my throat and set me on fire. Our dad was screwed up, wasn't he? But he loved us in his own unique way. I think they understood where each other was. They understood the unique position that Abraham was in with having these two families. And I think they came to peace with that. Well, I think part of the reason why these stories are in the Bible for us is that they provide hope for us. That as messed up as our families are, they're not as messed up as Abraham's. And if Abraham's family can find healing through these rituals, so can ours. And they can. So that's part of what I see, is that that need to tie up and to realize that our loose ends can be tied up as well. One of the rituals that we do as a church, the sacrament, is Holy Communion. I had a gentleman at a nursing home when we were in McCook he was a former pastor, and when we would bring him communion, he would always say that it was the meal that heals. The meal that heals. Not only can it heal us individually by putting us in a right relationship with God, but it provides that ritual for us to be healed among each other. Because it's interesting that when John Wesley gave his invitation, he'd say that all of you are in love and charity with each other and desire from this day henceforth to follow after the teachings of God. Come. He realized that we need to be in a right relationship with each other if we're going to be in a right relationship with God. And he also knew that in our being in a right relationship with God allowed us to be in a right relationship with others. So if you find that there is damage in your family, a communion meal is a way that you can start to deal with that and realize that I probably have some fault here too. To make your confession and to ask God to use rituals, funerals, weddings, family get-togethers to open that door and to provide that opportunity for a lasting healing to take place. Jesus died for us. He died for our families. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread and he broke it. He said, "This is my body, which is given for you." And likewise, after the supper, he took the cup. He said, "This is the cup of my blood that is shed for you for the forgiveness of your sins. Come and drink in remembrance of me." You don't need to be a member of this denomination. You don't need to be a member of the Benton Church to receive our communion. You just want to come and to be in a right relationship with God, or looking to be in a right relationship with your family and your friends, then come and take part of the meal that heals. Our stewards, if you would come.